the Byline Times Substack. We're looking at election results in England, Scotland, and Wales. We're joined by the Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov, and Asa Samarkey Roman, freelance journalist, columnist for The National. And nationalism of one sort or another is perhaps the dominant headline as the results have come through so far. These are described, of course, as local elections in England, but are very much national elections in Scotland and Wales. And as we record this, the SNP are on course for victory in Scotland under comeback kid John Swinney. Labour has admitted defeat to Plaid Cymru in Wales, while in England, the turquoise tide of reform has rattled both Labour and Conservatives. Beneath those headlines, though, loads of other interesting currents. Despite taking control in Newcastle under Lyme and winning all 12 of the seats that were up for grabs in the traditional Labour stronghold of Hartlepool, it looks like Reform's percentage vote is down compared to last year. The Green Party has fended off rows about anti-Semitism to win its first mayoral seat in the London borough of Hackney. So welcome both. Adam, what's your initial thoughts on election results, which as we speak are still coming in?
Yeah, so obviously what we've seen so far was heavily weighted, particularly overnight, was heavily weighted to what was going on in the north of England, particularly big gains for Reform, Labour falling back massively there. We haven't seen much in the way of how the Greens are doing. Obviously, they've taken the Hackney mayoralty. Some suggestions they've got a good chance of taking the Lewisham mayoralty as well. It's hard to look at these results as a whole and say that it's a bad night for Reform. As you say, if you look at the kind of percentage of their vote, it does seem to have gone down somewhat from the previous year. But on the basis of this, they will be pretty happy about where things are going. A terrible night for the Conservatives, losing out to Reform all over the country. They seem to have largely ignored that, and can be bad not pointing to one or two results in London where they've actually improved in central London. But I think that's probably if the willingness among people in those areas to vote for Reform rather than any great resurgence of Conservatives in the capital. Indeed, they lost all of their seats in Sutton, or 20 seats to the Lib Dems. So it's a real mixed picture. But I think it does show that we're into a sort of five-party politics era. If you go all across the country, there's kind of successes for everyone. Everyone that is, apart from Labour, of course, who have done badly pretty much across the board.
Indeed, I was intrigued. A couple of weeks ago, you and I did a podcast about the future of Sir Keir Starmer, in which you suggested that he doesn't really have much of one. And we were accused on that podcast of parroting lines that had been handed to us by Conservative Central Office. And the thing is that although there is unquestionably an agenda by the right-wing papers, especially the Mail and the Telegraph, to kind of do down Sir Keir Starmer, do down the Labour Party at every opportunity, when it appears that the Labour Prime Minister is performing poorly, and when you're picking up that intelligence at Westminster, we can't ignore it. We can't pretend that it's not happening. And there is a negativity towards Sir Keir Starmer, as candidates were telling me, people who were canvassing on the doorstep, as people are telling you, MPs, backbench Labour MPs in Westminster.
Absolutely. And this is not about boosting Reform. I mean, if you look at the coverage, a lot of it kind of features a sort of beaming picture of Nigel Farage. This isn't real. I mean, this is less, I'd say these results are less about sort of massive public enthusiasm for Reform UK. It's about satisfaction and disappointment in the government. And really the architect of these Reform gains, I would suggest, is not Nigel Farage, but it's actually Morgan McSweeney and the Blue Labour strategy that he has adopted over recent years. Is that strategy that's led to the collapse of support for Labour. And actually, if you look, John Curtis on the BBC made this point earlier. If you look at where Reform are making these big gains from Labour, it's not that there is this big direct switch from Labour to Reform. It's that the vote is being split. Labour voters are switching over to the Greens, and where Reform are doing well, the Greens are doing well. And that's not because people in those areas are necessarily massively in favour of Nigel Farage as Prime Minister. It's that they're unhappy with what they're seeing from Keir Starmer, from the Labour government, and they're disappointed, looking for an alternative, somebody to try and do something different. They went to Labour last time because they believed that there would be change. They believed that Keir Starmer would deliver the change that they've been asking for after 14 years of the Conservatives. They've been disappointed since then. They're now looking elsewhere, be it for reform or be it for the Greens. And I think that's largely what we've seen in these results.
Yeah, in fact, even before you mentioned Morgan McSweeney, one of our listeners, Kathy, said Morgan McSweeney has much to answer for. There's no question that Labour does sometimes, in what are called red wall seats, lose votes to reform. But the evidence suggests that the Conservatives are the biggest losers from reform, and that actually Labour is leaching votes to the left, to the Green Party. But under Morgan McSweeney's guidance, Labour did tack very far to the right, arguably lost touch with its core left-wing or centre-left constituency, and is now paying for that with a very heavy price.
Yes, and in some ways, I think these results are worse for the Conservative Party than for Labour. Not in terms of the decline in their vote, the decline in Labour's vote is greater, but just in what the response to that decline is. So if you look at Labour, there is a unanimity, and Keir Starmer came out this morning and said as well, they accept these are terrible results for them. There's disagreement about the cause of that results. Like Luke Akehurst on the right wing of the Labour Party are saying that this means Morgan McSweeney was right and needs to tack further to the right. Others are saying the complete opposite. There's disagreement about that. There's disagreement about whether or not Keir Starmer should go as Prime Minister. Some suggesting that Andy Burnham would be able to turn this around. Others disagreeing. But they're at least engaging with the fact that these are terrible results. Look at the Conservative Party. There is zero engagement. In fact, they're even suggesting that these are good results. Kemi Badenoch out on the stump this morning saying, we're back, on the basis of going backwards in these elections. You cannot find an example of another official opposition party shortly 2 years after a general election, losing a general election, actually going backwards in terms of the vote. It's almost unprecedented that we're seeing this. And to face that and to see your party getting wiped out by the Lib Dems in places like Sutton, being wiped out by Reform in other parts of the country, and then say, actually, we're back, we're doing really well. And this, I don't even think that this is spin from the Conservative Party. I think this is genuinely what they believe. They're just zeroing in. I think the longer they carry on with that business to what's happening to them, I think this could be really terminal for the Conservative Party, because the Labour Party are in real trouble. But we shouldn't avoid that. And Keir Starmer's in real trouble. They at least acknowledge there's a problem, and there's a possibility that Keir Starmer can stand down. They get someone who's able to turn it around. Right now, I see no chance that Kemi Badenoch's going to stand down, or there's no pressure for her to stand down. And they're going to lurch into the next general election, where Reform could replace them as the party of the right did.
So let's talk a bit about Scotland, because it looks as though the SNP are nailed on for a big majority. That's the evidence from the votes and results that are in so far. Anas Sarwar, the Labour leader, has already acknowledged defeat. And as in Wales, where Wales is likely to lose the Senedd for the first time since devolution, and it's accepted defeat there as well. I mean, Labour not only feeling the squeeze as we've described in England, but arguably feeling the squeeze even more in Wales and Scotland, where you are.
Absolutely. Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, was on television earlier saying that the party really was hurting. Labour is going to have a very, very difficult day. But again, this was something that was quite expected, and I remember after the general election just a couple of years ago, after Keir Starmer won that resounding majority in the country, a lot of the commentary was about how this was going to be a huge help for Anas Sarwar. This was going to set him on the path to victory at the Holyrood elections. And a couple of years down the line, it's a totally contrary picture, just because Keir Starmer and the Labour government are so unpopular in Scotland. And I think we shouldn't misinterpret why a lot of Scottish voters, a lot of SNP voters, switched their vote in 2024 in favour of the Labour Party. They were lending their vote because they wanted the Tories out. I think sometimes we tend to forget that there's an original problem for Labour after that 2024 election was won. It won because people wanted the Tories out. It wasn't really a referendum in favour of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. And after 2 years in power, a lot of people are just saying, this is not the change that we expected after the Labour Party took over, especially given all the scandals. At least people voted for having this kind of drama-free, common decency politics that we're not really seeing now at the UK level. So definitely a very difficult night for Scottish Labour. The SNP is holding strong. They're keeping most of their constituencies at the moment. We still have a lot of results that need to come in just because the vote started this morning. There was no votes overnight. So we'll have a clear picture of the next Scottish Parliament in the early evening. But so far, the SNP is doing well at constituency level. But the debate wasn't really whether they were going to be the biggest party in this election. I think all the polls showed that it was going to be the case, and it's definitely on course towards that. But the debate was whether it was going to win an overall majority. It looks like at the moment they won't. The goal for John Swinney, the outgoing First Minister, was to basically trigger a second independence referendum with this second overall majority. So now the question will be, how will he still keep pushing towards independence, in favor of independence, while he failed to reach his destination? So that will be
it's possible, isn't it? That, as you say, the forecasts I'm seeing as well are that the SNP will win, but it won't have an overall majority. Potentially, perhaps it could form a coalition, maybe with the Scottish Greens. I noticed that Angus Robertson, SNP minister, had lost his seat in Edinburgh to the Scottish Greens. And to be clear, the Scottish Greens are different to the Green Party of England and Wales and skew towards nationalism as well, skew towards independence for Scotland. So you could have pro-nationalist parties having an overall majority in Scotland, but I think it would be harder for John Swinney to argue if he doesn't have an overall majority as the SNP that he has a mandate for a new referendum.
The Greens. So yes, you're absolutely right. The Greens are also pro-independence in Scotland, and they're on course to have one of their best results in the Scottish Parliament election since devolution. They're looking to gain several MSPs and even constituency MSPs for the first time. So we just saw that Lorna Slater, who used to be in the Scottish government under Nicola Sturgeon, she was the Green co-leader. She's just won against the SNP in Edinburgh Central. They can also win constituencies in Glasgow. So it will be an interesting one to say. But the Greens have insisted during this whole campaign that it's not just with the SNP that there's a mandate to have a second independence referendum. What they're saying is that if the Scottish people vote for a pro-independence majority, so parties that say explicitly a vote for us is also a vote in favor of that second referendum to have independence, then it's only logical that Scotland should not be denied the right to choose. At the very least, let's agree on Scotland's right to choose. But this is something that John Swinney is going to have to clarify. Who is he going to rely on to get budget passed, etc.? But what was quite interesting at the last budget vote, so the SNP was already a minority government a few months ago. But they managed to get the Greens on board by promising things like more free public transportation. But they were also able to get the support of the Lib Dems. So it's actually two possibilities for the SNP there, depending, of course, how close they are to having that overall majority of 65 MSPs. Are they going to be more inclined to work again with the Greens, knowing that the last time that they did, it ended up quite dramatically with the Greens basically storming out of government, or are they going to lean more on the Liberal Democrats and maybe take a more discreet stance of independence?
Adam, Asa touched on something there I think is really important to recognise and maybe reflect upon as well, which was the shallowness of Labour's majority at the last general election. Yes, they won by a landslide, but that was because of the quirks of our first past the post system. If you have support, significant support, but it's thinly spread across the whole country, you've got more chance of winning a greater number of seats than if you have lots of support concentrated in particular areas. And Diane Abbott, former Labour minister, close aide of Jeremy Corbyn, pointing out that Sir Keir Starmer won his landslide with fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn managed in both, I think, 2019 and 2017. And despite the fact, despite the size of his of the landslide, Asa was saying that a lot of SNP voters lent their votes to Labour because they were determined to get the Tories out. I think that was certainly true in England and Wales as well.
Yeah, I think it is one of the quirks of the first past the post system. Labour won huge majority last time on a lower share of the vote than Labour lost the 2017 general election by a large margin. On the other hand, we actually like to see an even lower share of the vote win the next general election. So even though Labour won in the 30s, won this huge landslide, we could see Reform actually getting a large majority on the basis of 25, 26% of the vote, just because the vote is so spread across the country. And it's, I think that there was a real opportunity after the last general election for Keir Starmer's government to come in and actually reform the electoral system, bring in a form of proportional representation, even some quite minor reform. The fact that we've gone into these elections now and we're holding mayoral elections still on first past the post, which was changed by the last Conservative government. If they'd just made that very simple change, they would have been in a much better position to actually win some of these mayoral elections this time. They could have made that change on a national level as well. These local elections, you look at some of the big wins that Reform are making across the UK are on the basis of relatively small percentage of the vote. It's just the vote is split across so many different parties. And so that was a change that Labour could have made, and they didn't. And I think it's going to hurt them at these local elections, and I think potentially it could hurt them in the next general election as well.
Yeah, I suppose it points, doesn't it, to the lack of boldness of Sir Keir Starmer's government. I mean, let us not underestimate the challenge that they faced when coming into Westminster. They'd had 14 years of Conservative-led austerity. Public services were on their knees, and Labour will say, look, we can tell a positive picture here about reducing waiting lists in the NHS. We've brought in renters' rights, for example, that there has been progress, and that has been against a very difficult backdrop of the war in Ukraine, more recently the oil price shock occasioned by the US and Israeli invasion of Iran. So they would say, look, this has been a pretty tough inheritance, and it's also been a pretty turbulent time in geopolitics, but which nevertheless impacts upon our domestic politics here in the UK.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that they did have a terrible inheritance as a government, possibly the worst of any incoming government for some decades. I think that's fair to say. It's also fair to say that they haven't really done much in that situation around. Keir Starmer could have come in and made lots of positive changes. The problem is that now, we've spoken a lot about immigration over the last couple of years, and the Labour government's spoken a lot about immigration. We commissioned some polling this week about what is driving voters' decisions in these local elections. And far and away now, the biggest factor driving people's votes is the economy. And that a lot of that is down to the Iran war and things completely out of the government's control. But again, you need to have a clear sense from Downing Street that they have a plan to deal with that. And I think a lot of the reason why we're seeing this kind of collapse in support for Labour is less to do with the kind of global issues of the economy, less to do with individual policies, some of which, as you say, have been positive. It's more to do with a sense that voters have. Luke Shaw of the organisation More in Common told us this as well. The sense that the centre doesn't have a grip on all of these issues. There's not a clear sense of leadership. But it's less about individual policies. I think public will agree or disagree with various things that Keir Starmer has done. But there is an abiding sense, and this comes up on the doorstep. Campaigners have said this during this election. The sense that Keir Starmer is weak, and they just don't trust him. They may trust him on some, global issues and dealing with Trump and all the rest of it. When it comes to the economy, when it comes to dealing with his own government, with his own MP, there's a sense of drift, there's a sense of chaos. And that's for the last Conservative Party. That's when things started to go wrong for them, when there was a similar sense of drift and a similar sense of chaos. Unfortunately, that came for the Conservatives towards the end of their 14 years in government. This has happened to the Labour Party within 2 years of them coming back into power. And so this is why there is a real drive among some people in the Labour Party for there to be a change, because they believe that this should be a winnable situation for Labour. We're only 2 years from a landslide victory. This is a winnable election. We're facing Reform, who many voters have got big doubts about. If they had somebody in to replace Keir Starmer who had a clearer sense of direction for the government, a clearer sense of leadership, was not seen as weak by the electorate as a whole, and they could turn the situation around. Problem is, who is that person going to be? There is a kind of consensus now that that person within the Labour Party, or the broadest consensus in the Labour Party, is actually be Andy Burnham. I think, as we discussed last time we had one of these sessions, that's looking very difficult.
Yeah.
There are some suggestions from Burnham supporters that perhaps they're going to try again, but they believe they've secured another by-election. Would Downing Street have the strength after these local elections to Burnham to stand in it again? I think that's the big question. I don't think it's really clear where this is going to go. Does Starmer have the strength to stop him, or would that trigger an actual leadership challenge against him? I think that's the big question that we're facing in the few weeks.
Asa, when we talk about the ways in which Scotland and indeed Wales are different from England, it's certainly the case of Scotland. I think people who know a bit about Scotland on this side of the border, from where I'm speaking, would think of it as being a more socially progressive place, a place where, even if it's the SNP in power rather than Labour, that there is a kind of a socialist tinge to the country. And it's never been a particularly friendly place to Conservatives, albeit that the Conservatives do have seats and constituencies in which they do well. And I'm slightly puzzled by the success of Reform in Scotland, in the sense that it does feel like a quintessentially English phenomenon, or at least it has done until now. A lot of its success has either been in the south of England or in rundown industrial communities in northern England. So what drives it, and we have to hedge this, relative success in Scotland, but I'm just intrigued that it's had much traction at all in Scotland.
Yes, you're completely right. I think until quite recently, Scotland thought it was quite immune to, the threat of the radical right and the threat of the far right. And now we're seeing that, the Nigel Farage's ideas are representing more and more of the Scottish electorate. And I think it will be a shock for a lot of people who will be thinking, okay, what's happened to this country? We don't really recognize it. But I think it's interesting to see what are the different, drivers, what is attractive to reform to some people. I think, so it is definitely about immigration. You can't really remove this as a key driver of the reform vote. But it's a general feeling that things have gone a little bit too woke, a little bit too progressive. You need to rein it in. Especially in Scotland, we had a lot of very contentious and fiery debates around trans people's rights. I feel it's been very divisive on society. So definitely, I think this is one of the reasons why the reform vote is so attractive to some Scottish voters. There's also this idea that politics, the institutions, the establishment doesn't represent normal people anymore. There's a word in French, the dégagisme. So that's a word to say basically they can all F off, basically, which is the politicians, the media, people who represent kind of the elite, but not necessarily the elite in the meaning that is expected, which is the financial elite. When you think about it, reform is pretends to be this great representative of the people, but it's some very, very rich people at the top of it. They're accepting massive donations, so there's definitely a link with money there. So it's quite funny that they seem to be so anti-elite. But this is definitely something that resonates with the Scottish electorate.
Yeah, well, I think we're on Byline Times, and Adam and our colleague Josiah Mortimer have done superb work on exposing both some of the most overtly, horribly racist tweets and comments made by Reform candidates. There's the massive donations made by this Thai exile, Christopher Harborne, to Nigel Farage, which have come to light, not always been declared, not always been satisfactorily explained by Farage, things which might sink another politician or might sink another party. But there is this ability that Reform has, in a sense, to, and perhaps in the way that Trump does, to reach beyond rational argument and tap into emotion.
Yes, absolutely. I think they tap into this, underlying feeling of being disenfranchised, to be excluded, to be looked down upon, being humiliated, and having no security. I think we need to remember the, take back control slogan of the Brexit vote over 10 years ago. It's going to be 10 years, actually, 2026. So it's going to be the 10th year anniversary. And it says a lot, I think, and it speaks a lot to what people feel. But then in Scotland, it's still, I feel in certain part, a few parts of the country, it's very polemical to say that you're a Reform voter. Certainly in my constituency in Edinburgh, in Leith, this is potentially, they're going to make some gains here, but you will be ruthlessly mocked and derided if you openly say you're a Reform voter. I think this is still something that exists in Scotland. Sometimes I feel like we need to remember that, a majority of voters are still voting for those parties that are more socially progressive, are closer to civic nationalism, which is the principle that if you live in Scotland, that makes you Scottish. And that's kind of, the end of the debate. I still feel this is a majority view, but certainly it's a threat at the moment because Reform is making such gains.
Yeah, no, I think, well, we talk about gains. I mean, they're certainly gaining votes, aren't they? Not necessarily.
Exactly, yeah.
Not necessarily seats, but they're gaining support in Scotland. Anna Sarwar.
But they will probably win seats because, again, we don't have just first past the post.
Yeah.
There's also the list vote, the regional vote, where parties who don't get a lot of constituencies have an advantage, so they can get regional seats. So this is where it's going to be interesting to see how Reform performs.
Yes, Anna Sarwar.
I think we should also say.
So I was going to say, Anna Sarwar, the Labour leader, has lost the chance. He's missed out. He's lost his battle to win a constituency seat in Scotland under Scotland's different electoral system. So, I mean, that's the Labour leader losing in a first past the post battle.
Yeah.
Go on, sorry, Adam.
No, just say I think we should avoid the myth that the situation in Scotland is fundamentally different from the rest of the UK. There's always been a significant Conservative vote in Scotland, for instance. And I don't think we should underestimate to which Reform are essentially becoming the new Conservative Party. So lots of people in Scotland who previously would have been tempted to vote for Conservatives, obviously a lot of dissatisfaction with Kevin Badenoch's party, north of the border, just as there is south of the border, are now turning to Reform instead. And I think that's a large part of what we're seeing about the rise of Reform in Scotland, just as we're about the rise of Reform in England as well.
Yeah, Asa, Jane Perrier gets in touch and says, I voted SNP because I was voting tactically. I live in a tiny village, and even there, people were claiming that other people were coming in and taking over really deranged stuff in Jane's view. But there is that sense abroad, isn't there, about migration, about cultural difference, the emphasis on that, these culture wars that have been stoked by Reform and from which obviously they stand to gain most.
Definitely. I think the cultural wars, I'm not saying the cultural wars have not affected Scotland. They have, definitely. And I think, the really horrible, especially online debates around human rights, about trans rights, LGBTQ rights, immigration, they happened in Scotland as well. What I'm saying is that the party in power, I think it's important when you have the party in government that is going to be willing to go live on television to say that actually immigration is a good thing in Scotland, to kind of reestablish the fact that, the demography, you need to look also at the cold hard facts of demography. If Scotland still wants a a working population that's able to make sure that we have all the really nice social goods that we'd like to keep, pensions and the social system, then we're probably going to need immigration, and there's no going around that. And I think that has an important effect on the population. I think it makes people also more willing to, say these ideas out loud and be confident that, is going to be heard and is going to be shared. But it's true that if you look at the geography of where more, the more conservative vote, the more anti-migration vote is happening, it's not really in, like urban centers, etc. It's more in the more deprived parts of the country, and you can't really divorce that from the general sense of exclusion. The cost of living is getting, harder and harder, and people fear for their energy bills at the end of the year, and just this, feeling that you can't really have any security in your life. There's not much that you can control in your life when everything costs, housing, childcare, even the NHS is just getting more and more fragile. People are looking for more radical alternatives, in general. And I think on the right, it's manifesting by the fact that people are, especially, again, because we have a different voting system in Scotland, you can be a Tory voter and vote Tory at constituency level and Reform at the regional level. So you're really giving Reform a chance to actually come in and be quite disruptive. If you are a pro-independence voter, you can vote SNP at the constituency level and then Green at the regional level, because the Greens are a bit more radical than the SNP when it comes to the economy, not just human rights, but they want to actually tax wealth more than the SNP or Labour are saying in order to fund more free public transport. So they want universal public transport. They want universal childcare from the age of 6 months. So all of these things are going to need more money, and they're very willing to talk about tax in a way that other parties are not willing to. So everybody's kind of looking for that more radical alternative that's actually going to get people somewhere. But Reform is able to catalyze on this anger, and this feeling of exclusion in a way that's quite nefarious, but is getting quite effective at getting, those former Conservative voters.
Yeah, Adam, I think Astrid touches on a really important point here, which may explain the success to some extent of both Reform and of the Greens. The sense that people have, the insecurity, the cost of living crisis, which seems to be almost a perma-crisis now. And Labour's attitude essentially is we can tweak the economy, a bit of extra tax here, a little bit of public spending here, and it's unwilling, it seems to me, to challenge the fundamental concepts of the economy in which we live. And yet the kind of globalization that we see has undermined many traditional working class Labour voting communities. Labour seem to have a deaf ear about that. They don't seem to acknowledge that. And that's where gains to their right and their left are taking place. And yes, there may be better rights for renters and so on, but are they really going to grapple with those fundamentals that drive the anger that propels these populist parties?
Yes, a really interesting point. And I think this goes to a sort of fundamental flaw in Keir Starmer's premiership on the economy, but also on other issues as well. He's never really made the argument on any of these issues. He's taken a sort of managerial approach and left the arguments to other people. And we were just talking then about, on immigration, for example, about how the SNP has actually made the case for immigration and taken on that argument. That's the complete opposite of what the Keir Starmer government has done, which is to essentially accept the premise of Reform's argument on immigration and say we're going to handle it better. And the same could be said for their approach on the economy as well. And I think that the real flaw in Keir Starmer's approach is he doesn't really understand that as a politician, you have to make the argument. You have to go out and say, the Tommy Robinson way is wrong. And he blatantly, now that Morgan McSweeney has left Downing Street, there has been a little bit of moving towards that. And there are some signs that Keir Starmer at least accepts that he has failed to do that. But we still haven't seen him making those arguments on immigration, on the economy that you have to do as Prime Minister. And being Prime Minister, the main part of the job is making an argument, is actually trying to persuade the public rather than just manage and accept the premise of your opponents. And I think that's the mistake he made very early on. And
we've spoken, Adam, you and I, a fair bit about the book Get In by Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire, and you've taken issue, I think, quite forcefully with the idea that McSweeney was the great architect of Labour defeating the BNP in various constituencies and electoral battles. So we're certainly not giving that book a free pass, but within it, there was, it seemed to me, to be an essential truth, which is that Starmer is not really driven by conviction, and the suggestion that he's not really interested in political debates. Now, there's a level at which political debates can become quite nerdy and a little bit inward looking, but you need to have those debates. You've got to be interested in them in order to have the passion to articulate a vision. And clearly that's where Starmer is lacking.
Yeah, and I think it is an excellent book. I disagree with some of the sort of premises of it, but excellent piece of journalism. And I think one of the points it does make in there is that not only is Starmer not making these arguments to the country, we've seen that recently, he's not even making those arguments within government. So you have a situation where you have a meeting of the cabinet and everyone's sitting around discussing the local election results, whatever it might be. Nobody has a real clear sense of what Starmer's position is, that he's on that internally, let alone what he's trying to present to the country. And you need that as a politician. You need to be able to direct things from the centre and project that to your cabinet, who are then able to take that into their own briefs, into their own cabinet positions and departments, and direct that change, and then it filters out to the country. Without that, you have this very disjointed government where you've got some parts of government doing very interesting things like Ed Miliband on the environment, climate, and energy. You have other parts of the government like Lisa Nandy in the culture department seemingly doing absolutely nothing. No one's really managing who is doing what, and then coordinating that from the centre and then arguing it out to the as a whole. And that's the flaw of this partnership. And I think that was captured in that book, and I think we're seeing that written out in these local election results as well.
Let's talk briefly about the Conservatives, because they appear on the face of it to be at an existential risk, don't they? And I interviewed for the podcast a few weeks ago Andy Street, and Andy Street, along with the former Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, had launched this group called Prosper, which is a kind of centre-right Conservative, I think they reject the word think tank, but campaign group. And that is a perspective that seems to me to be absent from the Conservative Party under Kemi Badenoch. She pushes to the right. When I've heard Conservative strategists talking in the aftermath of the results, they've suggested, well, Kemi's got the vision. But Kemi doesn't have the vision, does she? She manifestly doesn't have the vision. And as with Labour, tacking ever further right in an attempt to kind of out-reform is appearing to be no more successful for the Conservatives than it is for Labour.
There was a really revealing story in the papers this week about David Cook, former Conservative frontbencher, very much on the kind of centre of the moderate centre of the party, obviously hated by Kemi Badenoch's wing of the party, has been nominated, I believe, for a peerage by Keir Starmer. And this apparently is absolutely infuriated Kemi Badenoch, and she's desperately trying to fight and get a peerage. If you cared about uniting and winning the election, you would just brush this off, even if you don't like David Cook very much, and say, well, this is great, the Conservative Party is moving forward. We've got one of our guys heading to the House of Lords. But that's just not the case at all. And Kemi Badenoch seems determined, as I say, not just to sort of carry on with the strategy that she's adopted so far, but just be completely oblivious to what we're seeing. And we've seen it. The party is losing to Lib Dems in some parts of the country, Reform in other parts of the country. Interestingly, The one area of the country where they seem to be doing well in these local elections is in inner London, in places like Westminster and Wandsworth, where I would suggest the Conservative electorate is significantly to the moderate centre, or at least very anemic to the very averse to voting to reform pay. Why I believe they've done so well in those areas and are doing so badly once you get out of the centre of London. So actually, for all the sense that the Conservative Party has spent over recent months suggesting that London has fallen, and we saw that stuff from Nick Timothy about Trafalgar Square and suggesting it's becoming an Islamic state and all the rest of it. Actually, London is one of the few bright spots for the Conservative Party, and there's a reason for that, because of moderate Conservatives in those areas are still sticking with the Conservative Party and are frightened of the prospects of reform. And that's a lesson I think that Kemi Badenoch should be learning from these results. But of course, she's not going to. She's just suggesting that she's doing brilliantly well, and it's all forward, despite the fact that they've actually gone backwards in these local election results.
Yeah.
As I said, pretty bad for them.
Does Kemi Badenoch butter any parsnips in Scotland, Elsa?
I don't think she does. I don't think she does. But this campaign was quite interesting for the Conservatives, because at the very end, their poll numbers got slightly better, because I think they try to have a different edge on reform, and their edge is that they're the arch unionists. They are the ones who are completely, sincerely in favor of the union reform. We're not so sure. And Labour, we can't count on them, because what they say is that Keir Starmer is so weak that if John Swinney even gets close to an overall majority, then of course he's going to say yes to another independence referendum. So really the vote, their pitch to the electorate was vote Scottish Conservative on your regional ballot to stop an SNP majority. So really it wasn't about winning and, governing Scotland for the next 5 years. It really was about trying to put the whole campaign on the train of the constitution independence, which is quite ironic for people who absolutely oppose having a second referendum and independence, because they were really talking about it all the time towards the end of the campaign. So this is why I think it appealed to those voters who are very hostile to independence and who thought actually the best vote to protect the union is the Scottish Conservatives.
One final thought, Adam. We're recording this on tea time on a Friday, and we will do another broadcast about the election results in a couple of days' time. So we appreciate this is not the full picture. And my own home city of Birmingham promises to be very interesting. Labour controlled, but the results so far suggest that it might end up being a hung parliament, no overall control. Reform have done quite well, I think, but so too have the Greens. I've got to break it to Robert Jenrick that a white man won the election in Handsworth in Birmingham. I know. I don't know how Mr. Jenrick's going to be able to deal with a white man in Handsworth. But the Greens, and
even though nobody speaks English there,
so he claimed.
Yeah.
And I don't want to overplay the guy and the Green success, but they went into the local elections with some, I think, in some cases, well-founded concerns about anti-Semitic views amongst some of their candidates, notwithstanding that they have a Jewish leader. I think some of their candidates were clearly unable to distinguish between legitimate criticism of Israel and a more broad brush attack on Jews generally. But I think they seem to have navigated that, as far as the results are concerned, reasonably well. Certainly picked up some seats in Birmingham, and they've held on to the seat in the estate where I grew up, called Druids Heath and Moneyhall, which, if you went to it, full of tower blocks and traditional council estate, you would say is fertile reform territory. But they've worked that area very well. So it will be less well publicised, and it isn't as kind of as headline grabbing, to be fair, as reform successes. But the Greens seem to have done okay in England anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use that word "okay." I texted a senior Green Party source yesterday, sort of towards the end of the voting, to see if they had any sense of how things were going for them, and they said things were going okay. And I think there is that sense that that these are good results, these are solid results, and our premise is on saying that most of their big targets in London are yet to come in as we're recording this.
Mm.
So they could still have very big gains in inner London. And overall, I think this is definitely a good, solid result for the Greens. It's not quite as good as they'd hoped for. I think that's fair to say. I think it's hard to avoid the conclusion that part of that is down to a lot of this issue of anti-Semitism, and particularly of Zach Plansley's handling of it. Indeed, his own personal ratings, we've seen a number of polls in the last week suggesting that that's really taken a big hit. Whether that's directly because of the anti-Semitism issue and how much it sways people's votes, I don't know. But whether it's to do with his handling of it in the sense that I think there's always been a sense with the Green Party is that they were seen as a kind of the nice choice, a kind of safe protest face. And they picked up voters on both the left and to a certain extent the right, but I think they were just the kind of safe, a nice alternative as a protest. When you have all these kinds of stories about dodgy candidates and racist views and all the rest of it, I think that's taken the shine off of them a bit. And I suspect that probably has had some impact. And they probably, although these are good results for the Greens and they could still pick up some really quite impressive results in London, I don't think they've done quite as well as they would have hoped for even a couple of weeks ago.
Adam, thank you so much for your time. Adam Bienkov, Byline Times political editor. Thanks also to Asa Samarkey Roman. Asa is a freelance journalist, columnist for The National. And as I say, we will do another broadcast about the election results probably on Monday, when we'll be hopefully in a position to mop everything up. But thank you so much for your time, whether you're listening or watching live on Substack or later on via the Byline Times podcast. And just to say, if you like what we do and you want to support our work, please take out a subscription to the Byline Times, our wonderful monthly news magazine edited by Hardeep Matharu, and some of the best articles around politics and culture that you can read anywhere. Take out a subscription over at bylinetimes.com. That's our news breaking website. We'll see you again very soon. Thank you to Asa. Thank you to Adam. And thank you to you. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.